When I walked into that Los Angeles courtroom, the first thing that hit me was the silence. Not the peaceful kind you find in a library, but the tense, suffocating silence that comes right before a storm. My parents were already seated at the plaintiff's table, their backs straight as rulers, confidence radiating from every pore. Victoria adjusted her designer handbag with manicured fingers while Charles checked his Rolex, both of them looking like they owned the world. And why wouldn't they? To everyone watching, they were America's sweethearts, the beloved hosts of television's most popular lifestyle show, all perfect smiles and practiced charm. I was just Emma, the granddaughter they'd abandoned 22 years ago, the one who'd supposedly manipulated their dying father into leaving her everything. But something was about to change, something they never saw coming. Judge Marcus Nolan entered, his silver hair catching the courtroom's fluorescent lights. He was known for being tough but fair, a man who'd built his reputation on cutting through lies like a hot knife through butter. As he settled into his chair and adjusted his glasses, his eyes swept across the room, taking in the packed gallery, the news cameras, the circus atmosphere that surrounded high-stakes estate battles. Then his gaze landed on me. I watched his expression shift from professional detachment to something else entirely. Recognition. His eyebrows raised slightly, and he leaned forward, studying my face with the intensity of someone seeing a ghost. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the courtroom chatter like a blade. "You're her?" The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's confident smile flickered like a candle in the wind. My father's drumming fingers stopped mid-beat. The entire room held its breath, sensing that something monumental was about to unfold. But to understand why that moment mattered, you need to know how it all began. You need to know about the day my parents left me behind and the man who picked up the pieces they scattered. I was 5 years old when they drove away. 5 years old and standing in the circular driveway of my grandfather's Santa Barbara estate, watching their silver convertible disappear through the iron gates like a mirage dissolving in the California heat. The Santa Barbara sun was merciless that afternoon, beating down on everything except the ice-cold fear spreading through my chest. My mother, Victoria, had crouched in front of me just minutes before, her white summer dress pristine despite the heat, the scent of her expensive perfume mixing with the ocean breeze. "Be good for Grandpa, sweetheart," she'd said, her smile bright but brittle, like fine china with hairline cracks. Her lipstick was perfect, her hair was perfect, but her eyes looked empty. "Flight?" I'd asked when I heard my father mention missing one. "Where are you going? Can I come?" The pause that followed lasted forever. Victoria's mask slipped for just a heartbeat, and I saw something raw underneath. Guilt, maybe. Or relief. "It's just a quick trip, darling. We'll be back soon." But even at 5, I could hear the lie in her voice. She didn't hug me goodbye. Instead, she leaned close enough for her diamond earrings to brush my cheek and kiss the air beside my face, like she was performing for invisible cameras. Then they were gone, their car disappearing in a cloud of dust and broken promises. I chased after them until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, screaming for them to come back, but only the seagulls answered. That's when I felt it. A steady hand on my shoulder, firm and warm and real. "They don't understand what they've lost, my dear," Grandpa Henry said, his voice soft but certain. He knelt beside me in his expensive suit, not caring about the dirt, and brushed the tears from my cheeks. "You'll never be unwanted again." That night, he made me hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, standing at the stove himself instead of calling for staff. He tucked me into bed in a room that felt as big as a cathedral, and when I asked if my parents would come back, he was quiet for a long time. "Some doors, once closed, should remain shut," he finally said, smoothing my hair with gentle fingers. "From now on, love lives right here." That was the night I stopped being Charles and Victoria's daughter and started being Henry Whitmore's granddaughter. And what a grandfather he was! Henry Whitmore wasn't your typical billionaire. Yes, he had the mansion on the cliffs, the private jets, the boardrooms full of powerful men hanging on his every word. But he also had something rare in that world. Integrity. He'd built Whitmore Industries from nothing, turning a small shipping company into a global empire. But he'd never forgotten where he came from or what mattered. Every morning at 6 sharp, he'd knock on my door. "Up, Emma. The world doesn't wait for those who linger." We'd have breakfast together in the kitchen, him with his black coffee and newspaper, me with cereal and questions about everything I read over his shoulder. Never believe a story just because it's printed, he'd tell me, pointing to headlines. Truth hides beneath the surface, waiting for those who dare to dig. He taught me to see through lies, to spot the difference between what people said and what they meant. When politicians came calling for donations, he'd make me sit quietly in the corner and watch their faces, their gestures, the way their eyes moved when they made promises. "What do you see?" he'd ask afterward. "They're scared of you," I'd say. Fear keeps people honest. But Henry Whitmore's real power wasn't fear, it was respect. Employees didn't work for him because they had to, they worked for him because they wanted to. He knew their children's names, remembered their anniversaries, showed up at their funerals. When the company hit tough times, he cut his own salary before laying off a single worker. "Money is like salt water," he'd often say. "The more you drink, the thirstier you become. Make sure what you crave is worth it." By the time I turned 16, I understood that my grandfather wasn't just wealthy, he was wise. And wisdom, he taught me, was the only inheritance that really mattered. That's when he gave me the journal, a small leather-bound book with pages soft as silk. "For your truth," he said. "One day the world will try to change it. Don't let them." I had no idea then how prophetic those words would prove to be. The years passed like chapters in a book, each one teaching me something new about business, about people, about the weight of responsibility that comes with real power. When I turned 18, Grandpa brought me to board meetings. When I turned 21, he put my name on company documents. When I graduated from Stanford with honors in business and law, he was in the front row, tears streaming down his weathered face. "You're ready," he said that night over dinner. "Ready for whatever comes next." I thought he meant running the company. I thought he meant taking over the foundation he'd built to help underprivileged kids. I had no idea he meant facing the two people who'd created me but never wanted me. The morning I found him, the world felt different. The air was too still, the ocean too quiet, like nature itself was holding its breath. I'd gone to his study to ask about a contract I'd been reviewing, but he was slumped over his desk, his reading glasses still perched on his nose, his pen still in his hand. The last thing he'd written was a single line. "Truth in the wrong hands turns to poison." I didn't cry at first. I just stood there, staring at the man who'd filled every empty space in my life, who'd taught me everything about honor and integrity and standing up for what's right. When the grief finally hit, it was like a tidal wave, crushing and complete. His funeral was a who's who of American power. Politicians, CEOs, judges, even a former president came to pay their respects. But I barely noticed them. I was too busy watching the two figures in the front row, the ones who'd shown up like ghosts from a past I'd worked hard to forget. My parents looked good, I'll give them that. 22 years of television fame had been kind to them. Victoria's face was flawless. Her black dress probably cost more than most people's cars. Charles looked distinguished in his navy suit, silver at his temples adding gravitas to his television-ready features. When the service ended, they approached me like predators circling prey. "Emma," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "You've grown so much." "You remembered my name," I replied, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. Her smile tightened. "We're family. We should reconnect." Family? The word tasted like poison. "You left me here like I was baggage you couldn't carry." Charles stepped forward, his television charm replaced by something harder. "You always did have a flair for drama." That's when the lawyer appeared, clearing his throat and asking everyone to gather for the reading of the will. The room fell silent as Samuel Briggs, Grandpa's attorney for 30 years, opened the envelope with practiced ceremony. The late Judge Henry Whitmore leaves all properties, including the Whitmore residence, corporate assets, and financial holdings to his granddaughter, Emma Whitmore. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Victoria gasped, actually gasped, like she was in some daytime soap opera. "That's not possible," she stammered. He was old, confused. "This can't be legal." But Samuel wasn't finished. Judge Whitmore also left a message for his son and daughter-in-law. His eyes found my parents, and his voice turned cold. It reads, "Those who abandon truth for comfort have already surrendered their inheritance. That was the moment I knew the war had begun. The look in my mother's eyes, the way my father's hands clenched into fists, the whispered conversations as the other guests filed out, it all spelled trouble. Big trouble. "You'll regret this," Victoria hissed as they prepared to leave. "You don't deserve what he built. Neither do you," I said, and meant every word. A week later, the lawsuit arrived. Charles and Victoria Whitmore versus Emma Whitmore, claiming undue influence, fraud, and elder abuse. They were asking for the entire estate, every penny of the one. $6 billion Grandpa had left me. The media went insane. Billionaire's granddaughter sued by estranged parents. Family fortune feud turns ugly. Did Emma Whitmore steal her inheritance? The headlines screamed from every newspaper, every gossip website, every morning show. Suddenly I was public enemy number one, the greedy granddaughter who'd supposedly manipulated a dying old man. Paparazzi camped outside the estate. Reporters followed me to the grocery store, to the lawyer's office, to the cemetery where I went to visit Grandpa's grave. My attorney, Robert Hayes, was a calm man in his 60s who'd handled high-profile cases for decades. "They're moving fast," he told me during our first meeting. "Your father still has connections in Los Angeles County. This won't be easy." "I'm not afraid of them," I said, though my hands were shaking as I spoke. "You should be," Robert replied grimly. "They're playing for everything, and they're playing dirty." He was right. Over the next few months, my parents' legal team tore into every aspect of my relationship with Grandpa. They claimed I'd isolated him from family, interfered with his medical care, pressured him into changing his will. They painted me as a gold-digging manipulator who'd taken advantage of a lonely old man. The worst part was watching people believe it. Former friends stopped calling. Business associates became distant. Even some of the household staff looked at me differently, like they were seeing me for the first time. But I had something they didn't expect. I had the truth. And I had the journal. The night before the trial began, I sat in Grandpa's study, surrounded by his books and his memories, and opened that leather-bound journal to a random page. His handwriting was clear and strong, even in entries from years before his death. Emma asked me today why her parents never visit. I told her some people are too busy performing their lives to live them. She has more wisdom in her little finger than Charles ever had in his entire body. This estate will be hers someday, not as a reward, but as protection. She'll need it to defend herself against the very people who should have protected her. Tears blurred my vision as I read page after page of his thoughts, his observations, his growing certainty that I was the only one who could carry on his legacy of integrity and service. Every entry was dated, every observation carefully recorded. It wasn't just a journal, it was a roadmap of his mind, proof that he was completely competent right up until the end. The morning of the trial, storm clouds gathered over Los Angeles like an omen. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers, drawn by the spectacle of a billionaire family tearing itself apart in public. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table looking like they'd stepped off a magazine cover, all polish and practiced grief. Their lawyer, Elliot Graves, was known for his theatrical courtroom style and his willingness to destroy reputations for the right price. I took my seat next to Robert, my heart hammering so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. The gallery was packed with reporters, legal observers, and society types who treated high-profile trials like entertainment. Then Judge Marcus Nolan entered, and everything changed. He was in his early 70s, silver-haired and dignified, with the kind of presence that commanded instant respect. He'd been on the bench for over 30 years, handling some of the biggest cases in California legal history. As he settled into his chair and surveyed the courtroom, his eyes landed on me. I watched his expression shift, saw recognition dawn in his features. He leaned forward, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "Step forward, please." My legs felt like water as I approached the bench. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "You're Henry Whitmore's granddaughter," he said, not really a question. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Nolan removed his glasses slowly, never taking his eyes off my face. "I clerked for your grandfather once, many years ago. He was a superior court judge before he went into business. He paused, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He told me once, "If my granddaughter ever appears in your courtroom, listen closely. She'll be telling the truth." The gasp that went up from the gallery sounded like wind through trees. Behind me, I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, my father's muttered curse. The reporters were scribbling frantically, sensing that this case was about to become something much bigger than a simple estate dispute. Judge Nolan straightened in his chair, his expression returning to professional neutrality, but something had changed. The entire atmosphere of the courtroom had shifted. "Proceed," he said, but his tone carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Elliot Graves rose with his characteristic swagger, but I caught the slight tremor in his hands as he began his opening statement. "Your Honor, we intend to prove that Emma Whitmore systematically isolated her grandfather from his family, manipulated his medical care, and coerced him into changing his will through undue influence and fraud." He painted a picture of me as a scheming manipulator, a young woman who'd taken advantage of an elderly man's loneliness and declining mental state. He spoke of my parents' desperate attempts to reconnect with their father, their heartbreak at being shut out of his final years. It was a masterful performance, full of emotion and righteous indignation. If I hadn't lived through the real story, I might have believed it myself. Robert's opening was quieter but more powerful. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Henry Whitmore was a man of extraordinary intelligence and integrity right up until his death. His decision to leave his estate to his granddaughter was not the product of manipulation, but of careful observation over 22 years. Emma Whitmore didn't steal this inheritance. She earned it through devotion, love, and the kind of character her grandfather spent his lifetime trying to instill in others." The first week of testimony was brutal. Graves paraded a series of witnesses who painted my grandfather as increasingly isolated and paranoid in his final years. They claimed I'd fired longtime staff members, restricted his visitors, and pressured him to cut ties with his son and daughter-in-law. Some of it was true, in a twisted way. I had been protective of Grandpa, especially after his mild heart attack 2 years before his death. I'd screened his calls and visitors, but not to isolate him, to protect him from the stress and drama that followed my parents wherever they went. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Ticantine. Patricia Wells, a geriatrician who'd examined Grandpa once at my parents' request. She testified that he'd seemed confused and agitated during their meeting, possibly showing early signs of dementia. Robert's cross-examination was surgical. "Wells, how long was this examination?" "Approximately 30 minutes. And in that 30 minutes, you determined that a man who'd been running a multi-billion-dollar company was mentally incompetent?" I suggested further evaluation. "Which never happened, because Judge Whitmore refused to see you again. Is that correct? Did you know that your examination was requested and paid for by the plaintiffs in this case?" Wells shifted uncomfortably. "I was told his family was concerned." "His family? You mean the son and daughter-in-law who hadn't spoken to him in over 20 years? "Objection," Graves called out, but the damage was done. By the end of the first week, I could see doubt creeping into some of the jurors' faces. The media was having a field day, with talking heads debating whether I was a devoted granddaughter or a master manipulator. That weekend, Robert and I prepared for the counterattack. We had boxes of evidence, medical records showing Grandpa's mental acuity right up until his death, financial records proving his decisions were carefully considered, and testimonies from dozens of people who'd interacted with him regularly. But our secret weapon was the journal. Page after page of Grandpa's thoughts, observations, and reflections, all in his own handwriting, all dated and consistent. It was a window into his mind, proof that he'd been thinking clearly and making deliberate choices about his legacy. The second week began with my mother taking the stand. Victoria had always been a performer, and she gave the performance of her lifetime. Tears flowed at exactly the right moments. Her voice broke with perfect timing. She spoke of her deep regret at the rift with her father, her desperate desire to reconcile before it was too late. "We only wanted to be a family again," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "But Emma had poisoned him against us. She made him believe we only wanted his money." It was masterful acting, and I could see some of the jurors buying it. The grieving daughter, shut out by a manipulative granddaughter. It played into every stereotype about greedy relatives fighting over estates. but Robert was ready for her. "Whitmore, when did you last speak to your father before his death?" Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment. It had been several years. "How many years?" "I'm not sure exactly." Robert pulled out a phone record. "According to these records, the last call between you and your father was on December 15th, 2001. His death was on March 3rd, 2023. That's over 21 years, isn't it? We were busy with our careers. Too busy to call your father for 21 years?" "Objection," Graves said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sustained," Judge Nolan ruled, but the point had been made. Robert continued methodically dismantling my mother's testimony. He showed how she and my father had tried to contact Grandpa only after his heart attack, when they realized he might not live much longer. He demonstrated that their concern had coincided perfectly with rumors about his estate planning. By the time he was done, Victoria looked less like a grieving daughter and more like what she really was, a performer who'd missed her cue and was trying to ad-lib her way back into the spotlight. My father's testimony was shorter but no less damaging to their case. Charles had always been the more honest of the two, in his own twisted way. He didn't pretend to be heartbroken about his relationship with Grandpa. Instead, he focused on what he saw as the unfairness of the will. "I'm his son," he said simply. "Emma is just his granddaughter. Blood should matter more than sentiment." Robert's cross-examination was brutal. "Whitmore, in the 22 years after you left your daughter at your father's house, how many times did you visit?" "We visited when we could." "I'm asking for a number, sir." Charles looked at his lawyer, then at the judge, then back at Robert. "I don't know exactly. Would it surprise you to learn that the estate's visitor logs show you visited exactly 3 times in 22 years? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. 3 times. In 22 years. And on each of those occasions, you asked your father for money, didn't you? "We discussed business opportunities. Is that what you call asking for a loan to fund your television show?" By the time Robert finished with him, Charles looked like exactly what he was. A man who'd abandoned his daughter and ignored his father until it became financially inconvenient. But the real turning point came when I took the stand. I'd been dreading this moment for months. Facing a courtroom full of strangers was one thing, but having to tell the truth about my childhood, about the abandonment and the love I'd found afterward, that was something else entirely. Robert started with the basics: my age, my education, my role in Grandpa's companies. Then, he asked the question I'd been preparing for. "Emma, tell the court about the day your parents left you with your grandfather." I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering that 5-year-old girl standing in the driveway, watching the car disappear. When I opened them again, I saw my parents at the plaintiff's table, their faces carefully neutral. "I was 5 years old," I began, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "They told me they were going on a quick trip. They said they'd be back soon." I paused, meeting my mother's eyes across the courtroom. That was 27 years ago. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling. "In all that time, how often did your parents visit you?" 3 times that I can remember. The last time was when I was 12. They stayed for about an hour. "Did they call?" "Sometimes. Usually around Christmas or my birthday." The calls got less frequent as I got older. Robert nodded, then reached for a familiar leather journal. "Emma, do you recognize this?" "It's my grandfather's journal. He gave me one like it when I turned 16 and told me to record my own thoughts." This was his. "Did you know he was keeping this journal?" "Not until after he died. I found it in his desk." Robert opened it to a marked page. "Would you read the entry dated March 15th, 2018? I took the journal with trembling hands. Grandpa's handwriting was as familiar as my own, neat and precise even in his personal thoughts. "Emma graduated summa cum laude today. I have never been prouder of anyone in my life." Charles called to ask for money for his new show but couldn't be bothered to ask about his daughter's graduation. I told him the bank was closed. Some investments are worth making, others are money thrown into a black hole. A few people in the gallery actually gasped. The contrast was stark. My grandfather's pride in my achievements versus his son's complete indifference. Robert guided me through several more entries, each one painting a picture of a man who was not only mentally competent, but deeply thoughtful about his family, relationships, and his legacy. Grandpa's words were sometimes harsh, but always honest. He wrote about watching my parents on television, about their superficial lifestyle, about their complete lack of interest in anything beyond their own fame and fortune. But he also wrote about me, about my curiosity, my kindness, my determination to learn everything he could teach me, about the way I treated the staff, the genuine interest I showed in the family business, my work with the foundation. She has the heart her father never developed. Read one entry from 2020. Emma sees people, not props for her own performance. The estate must go to her, not as a reward, but as a responsibility. She's the only one who understands that wealth is meant to serve others, not just the person who holds it. By the time I finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. Even Judge Nolan looked moved, though he maintained his professional composure. Graves's cross-examination was vicious. He accused me of coaching my grandfather, of influencing what he wrote in the journal. He suggested I'd forged entries, manipulated dates, created false evidence. But I was ready for him. For every accusation, I had an answer. For every twisted interpretation of events, I had documentation proving the truth. And through it all, I kept thinking about Grandpa's lessons about dignity under pressure. Graves, I said at one point, you can attack my motives, but you can't change the facts. I loved my grandfather, and he loved me. That's not manipulation. That's family. The courtroom erupted in applause, which Judge Nolan quickly gavelled down. But the damage was done. The jury could see through the smokescreen to the simple truth underneath. The final blow came when Robert called character witnesses. Person after person took the stand to testify about my grandfather's mental state in his final years. His personal physician, who'd examined him just weeks before his death. His business partners, who'd worked with him on complex deals right up until the end. His longtime housekeeper, who'd seen him every day and could attest to his sharp mind and clear thinking. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Judge Eleanor Martinez, who'd served with my grandfather on the State Judicial Committee until his retirement. Henry Whitmore was one of the finest legal minds I ever knew, she testified. Even in his 80s, he could dissect a complex legal argument faster than lawyers half his age. The idea that he was mentally incompetent when he revised his will is not just wrong, it's insulting to his memory. When all the testimony was finished, when all the evidence had been presented, when both sides had made their closing arguments, we had nothing left to do but wait. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days of pacing, of second-guessing, of wondering if we'd done enough to counter my parents' lies and manipulations. Finally, the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. Walking back into that courtroom was one of the longest walks of my life. My parents sat at their table, still maintaining their facade of confidence, but I could see the cracks showing. Victoria kept touching her hair nervously. Charles drummed his fingers on the table in a rhythm that had no pattern. Judge Nolan entered, and we all rose. The jury filed in, their faces carefully blank, giving away nothing. "Have you reached a verdict?" Judge Nolan asked. "We have, Your Honor." The foreman, a middle-aged woman who'd reminded me of my 5th-grade teacher, stood with a piece of paper in her hands. In the matter of Charles and Victoria Whitmore versus Emma Whitmore, we find in favor of the defendant. The plaintiffs have failed to prove undue influence, and the will of Henry Whitmore should be upheld in its entirety. The courtroom exploded. Reporters rushed for their phones. Spectators cheered or groaned, depending on which side they'd been rooting for. My parents sat in stunned silence, their carefully constructed case crumbling around them. But Judge Nolan wasn't finished. He gavelled for silence, and when the courtroom had quieted, he looked directly at my parents. "This court has rarely seen a more frivolous lawsuit," he said, his voice cold with controlled anger. The evidence presented here showed a clear pattern of abandonment and neglect by the plaintiffs, followed by a transparent attempt to profit from the very relationship they had destroyed. Justice does not belong to blood alone. It belongs to those who honor their commitments and live with integrity. He turned to me, and his expression softened slightly. "Miss Whitmore, your grandfather would be proud of how you conducted yourself in this courtroom. You've shown that his faith in you was well placed." Then he brought down his gavel one final time. "This court is adjourned." I sat there for a moment, unable to process what had just happened. We'd won. After months of attacks, accusations, and character assassination, the truth had finally prevailed. Robert put his hand on my shoulder. "It's over, Emma. You did it." But even as I savored the victory, I felt a profound sadness. This shouldn't have been necessary. My parents should have celebrated their father's life, not tried to profit from his death. They should have been proud of the granddaughter he'd raised, not resentful of her success. As I gathered my things and prepared to leave, my mother appeared beside me. Her perfect makeup was streaked with tears, her composure finally shattered. "You think this makes you better than us?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this, Emma. You'll end up alone, just like him." I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who'd given birth to me but had never been my mother. "I'd rather be alone than empty," I said quietly. Outside, the California sun was shining, bright and warm and cleansing. The reporters surged forward with their questions, but I only had one thing to say. "It was never about the money," I told them, my voice carrying across the courthouse steps. "It was about truth, and today, truth won." That night, I sat in Grandpa's study, the verdict papers on the desk beside me. The house was quiet, peaceful in a way it hadn't been since the lawsuit began. I opened his journal to the last entry he'd ever written. "Truth in the wrong hands turns to poison," I read aloud. "But in the right hands, it becomes armor." "You were right, Grandpa," I whispered to his portrait on the wall. "Truth really does have long arms." And today, it finally reached back. Months passed, and slowly, life returned to something approaching normal. The media attention faded. The estate settled into its new reality. I threw myself into running Grandpa's companies and his foundation, trying to honor the values he'd spent a lifetime teaching me. Then, one evening, as the sun painted the Pacific in shades of gold and red, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my father's number. I almost didn't answer. What could he possibly have to say after everything that had happened? But something made me pick up. "Emma?" His voice was different, softer somehow, uncertain. "Hello, Dad." There was a long pause. "I read the journal," he said finally. "Your grandfather's entries. All of them." I closed my eyes, remembering some of those passages. They hadn't been kind to my father. I didn't want to believe what he wrote about me, Charles continued. But I couldn't stop reading, and I realized he was right about everything. About what I'd become, about what I'd lost. His voice broke slightly. "I lost my way, Emma. I stopped being his son long before that will was signed. I stopped being your father even longer ago than that." "Why are you calling?" I asked. "Because I need you to know that I'm sorry. For leaving you. For blaming you. For becoming the kind of man he warned you about." He paused, and I could hear him struggling with emotions he'd kept buried for years. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed you to know." I walked to the window overlooking the garden Grandpa had planted for Grandma so many years ago. The roses were blooming, their scent carried on the evening breeze. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly, "but I know Grandpa would have wanted me to try." "That's more than I deserve," he said quietly. "You remind me of him, you know, the way you never back down from what's right." After we hung up, I stayed by the window as darkness fell over the estate. The conversation hadn't erased 27 years of abandonment and pain, but it was something, a crack in the wall between us, a possibility of healing. I thought about Grandpa's final lesson, the one he'd taught me without words. True justice wasn't about winning in courtrooms or defeating your enemies. It was about living with integrity, showing compassion even to those who'd wronged you, and understanding that the best revenge was a life well lived. As the first stars appeared over the Pacific, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day he died. Peace. Not the peace of victory, but the deeper peace that comes from knowing you've honored the values of someone you loved. "I understand now, Grandpa," I whispered to the night sky. "Justice was never about punishing them. It was about becoming worthy of the love you gave me." And in the gentle breeze that rustled through the roses, I could almost hear his reply. "Then I can finally rest, my dear girl. Then I can finally rest." The truth had set us all free, just as he'd always promised it would.
Thanks for sticking around. If you love this ending, subscribe and hit the bell so you're always first to watch. Comment below. Did you see that satisfying ending coming?